So today we're going to look at how we can draw the graph of a line given our slope-intercept form. And remember that slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, where m is our slope, and that's always the value in front of the x. And the b is what we call our y-intercept, and that's where the line will cross the y-axis. All right? So when we're going to draw the graph of a line given the slope-intercept form, the first thing we're going to do is look at our equation, and we're going to identify the slope and the y-intercept from that equation. So we practiced with that last week. When I give you the line y equals negative 3x plus 2, and I think about y equals mx plus b, I can see right now that my slope would be the negative 3, and my y-intercept would be that b value of 2. Now, when we're working with drawing a graph, even though we say the slope is negative 3, because we think about slope as rise over run, we're going to actually write that as a fraction. So when we have a whole number, remember we can put that over a 1 to turn it into a fraction. So that's just to help me with graphing, but technically the slope is really just that value of negative 3. Now my y-intercept is that b value of 2. And so when I identify my y-intercept and I say it's the y-intercept of 2, that's again really the ordered pair 0, 2, because it's the value for y when x is 0. With these two pieces of information, we're actually going to be able to create 2 points and be able to draw our graph of our line. So once we identify the slope and the y-intercept, the next thing we're going to do to graph our line is start by placing a point at the y-intercept. So if my y-intercept is the point 0, 2, that means I'm going to go right onto the y-axis. I'm not going to move left or right, and I'm just going to go right up to positive 2 on that y-axis. And there's my first point. Once I have my y-intercept, now I need a second point to draw my line. So that's where we're going to go ahead and count out the slope. And again, we're going to remember that slope is the same thing as the ratio of rise over run. It's that change in that vertical over that change in horizontal. So if my slope was negative 3 over 1, remember when we were thinking of rise over run, a rise of negative 3 would actually bring me down 3. So from my y-intercept, I'm going to go down 3 units. And then my run was positive 1, so I'm going to go to the right one. And we should remember that a slope of a negative number is going to decrease from left to right. So it makes sense that my points are going down from left to right. Now I'm going to go ahead and use a straight edge, and I'm going to connect my 2 points. As I connect them, I'm going to create the line, and then I'm going to put arrows at the end to say that they continue that pattern. It didn't come out very nicely. They continue that pattern. All right. So when we're working through that, that's all we have to do. We identify our slope and y-intercept. We place a point on our coordinate plane where the y-intercept is. Then from that y-intercept, we're going to count out slope using rise over run. And again, paying attention to our positive and negative slopes. If I have positive slopes, my graph should be increasing from left to right. And if I have a negative slope like this example, it should be decreasing. Once we have our 2 points, we can connect them and we draw ourselves a nice line like that. Okay? So let's look at a few more examples to make sure we understand what's happening here. So again, as I'm looking through these, if I think about my steps, I'm going to take my equation, and the first thing I'm going to do is identify my slope, again, thinking about y equals mx plus b. So in this example, my slope would be negative 1/3. Now, when the negative is just kind of in front of the fraction, you can really choose where you want to put it. So you can either write it as negative 1 over positive 3, or you can write that as positive 1 over negative 3. If there's one negative sign, you can choose to put that negative up in the numerator of your fraction or down in the denominator. That's up to you. The y-intercept is that value of positive 1, so my y-intercept is the ordered pair 0, 1. Once I identify my slope and my y-intercept, then remember we always graph that y-intercept first because that's really our first point that we actually have. So again, my y-intercept, I'm going to go right on to the point 0, 1. I'm going to go straight up onto the y-axis at positive 1. And then for this one, I'm going to let my slope, I'm going to choose -1/3 where I let the -1. So again, a slope of -1/3, I'm going to go down 1 and right 3. So from this y-intercept, I'm going to go down 1 and then right 3. And I would get that point right there. Now, if I had chosen the other slope, if I had chosen to do 1/-3, if I had chosen that slope for rise over run from my y-intercept, I would have gone up 1 and then left 3. Notice that it doesn't really matter which way I go. In the end, when I connect those points, my straight edge is just a piece of paper that I found laying around. When I connect these points, it doesn't matter if they land on the same line. So you can choose which version of the slope that you want to make your graph work out for you. So if you put the negative in the numerator, you went down 1 and right 3. If you put the negative in your denominator, you went up 1 and left 3, but we still created that same line. All right, let's look at another example here. We have y equals 4x minus 3. Again, if we think about our formula, y equals mx plus b, my slope is that +4. And again, for positive numbers that are positive integers like that, we put it over a 1 so we can see both that rise and that run. And my y-intercept this time, if we think about it, this is a -3. So that means my y-intercept was -3. So this time my y-intercept is going to be 0, -3. So when I go to plot my first point, I always graph my y-intercept first. I'm going to go straight down to -3 on my y-axis. And then from that y-intercept, I'm going to count my slope using rise over run. So I'm going to have a rise of 4 and a run of 1. So from my y-intercept, I'm going to go up 4 and then over 1. And there would be my second point. Again, it makes sense that it's going up from left to right because I had a positive slope. So we're going to go ahead and connect those two dots, draw our arrows, and we have ourselves our line there. Okay. Now there are a few special cases that I want to just quickly talk about as we're drawing these lines, because we knew that when we talked about graphs of lines that we had positive and negative slopes, but then we also had slopes of 0 and undefined. So I just wanted to give you a quick example of each of those so you can see what that would look like if we ever encountered those types of problems. So when we're looking at our special case, the first one we have here is y equals 3. Now, if we think about our formula, it's y equals mx plus b. So we're supposed to have some value of x to find our slope. But if we look at this equation, we have y equals 3, we have no x. So we can really think of this as y equals 0x plus 3. Because if I have no x, then I had 0 x's. So that means my slope in this case would be 0. And then our y-intercept would be that value of +3, that +3 there. So my y-intercept would be 0, 3. Now remember, when we have a slope of 0, that's our line that's horizontal. That's the line that goes straight across from left to right. That's how we always identified a slope of 0. Because what it's telling me is that I have a rise of 0, and then my run can be any number I want, because 0 divided by any number stays 0. So if we think about what we did with whole numbers, we put it over a 1. So we can do the same thing with 0. So to graph this, I'm going to go up to +3. And then I'm going to graph the rise of 0 and a run of 1. And I get that nice horizontal line at y equals 3. And if we think about it, in every single one of those points, my y coordinate would be 3, which is exactly what that line is predicting. Now, our last example, we had lines that had undefined slope. So when we're looking at undefined slope, that means I can't say y equals mx plus b, because if I could say that, like I did here, I would have a defined slope of 0. So when it's an undefined slope, you have an x with no y. And it's telling you that you're creating a line where every single x value is -1. So in this case right here, if x is -1, then I don't get a y-intercept. And I don't get a slope. My slope in this problem would be undefined. But what I do know is that I'm creating a line where every single x value would be -1. So I could go to -1, 0, or I could go to -1, +1, or I could go to -1, 2, or even -1, -4. Any point on this line right here is going to have an x value that's -1. And so my line is going to go straight up and down and be that undefined slope and create that nice vertical line. Okay, so you're going to practice working with graphing using slope and y-intercept. So hopefully these examples were helpful.